It was the early hours of May 7, 1945, in a modest red brick vocational school tucked away in the French city of Reims. No grand halls or opulent chambers, just a simple building that American soldiers nicknamed the Little Red Schoolhouse. But inside these unassuming walls, the fate of millions hung in the balance. Imagine this. The man who orchestrated the Allied victory in Europe, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Commander, deliberately chose to stay hidden in a small office down the hall. He refused to face the German delegation. Why? Because in that moment he wasn't just ending a war, he was drawing a line between justice and complicity that would reshape how the world viewed victory. What secret strategy were the Germans desperately clinging to, and how did Eisenhower's unyielding stance force their hand? Stick around because this isn't the surrender story you learned in history class, it's the untold drama of calculated bluffs, hidden fears, and a decision that prevented a potential catastrophe from igniting right after the guns fell silent. Let's set the scene properly. The war in Europe had raged for nearly 6 years, claiming countless lives and redrawing maps across continents. By spring 1945, the Third Reich was crumbling. Allied forces from the West, Americans, British, Canadians, and Free French, pushed relentlessly from Normandy's beaches toward the heart of Germany. From the east, the Soviet Red Army advanced with unstoppable momentum, capturing Berlin block by block. Hitler was gone, having taken his own life in a bunker just days earlier on April 30th. Power shifted to Grand Admiral Karl Donitz, who inherited a shattered nation and a desperate high command. Donitz's priority? Avoid total capitulation, especially to the Soviets, whom the Germans feared for their unyielding pursuit of retribution after years of brutal occupation in the East. Enter the German delegation, arriving in Reims amid a torrential downpour on May 6. First came Admiral Hans-Georg von Friedberg, head of the Kriegsmarine, the German Navy. He was a shadow of his former self, pale, gaunt, draped in a heavy greatcoat that seemed to weigh him down further. Friedberg had already surrendered northern German forces to British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, but now he faced the full Allied coalition. He entered the schoolhouse expecting negotiations, perhaps even a measure of respect befitting his rank. Instead, he met Lieutenant General Walter Bedell Smith, Eisenhower's no-nonsense chief of staff. Smith, known for his sharp temper and relentless drive, fueled partly by a chronic ulcer that never let him rest, was all business. No pleasantries, no seats offered. He slapped down the surrender document, unconditional capitulation of all German forces on every front, land, sea, air, to all allies including the Soviets. Friedberg's reaction was raw. He scanned the terms and broke down, tears flowing as he pleaded in halting English. "We can't surrender to the Russians," he insisted. This was the core of their gambit, a separate peace with the West. The Germans hoped to open the Western Front, allowing Allied troops to race to Berlin and potentially ally against the advancing Soviets. They were buying time to relocate troops and civilians westward, away from what they anticipated would be harsh Soviet reprisals. It was a calculated risk, rooted in the deep-seated animosities forged during the invasion of the Soviet Union years prior. But Smith stood firm, echoing Eisenhower's ironclad orders: no deals, no delays. The grand alliance with the Soviets, forged at conferences like Tehran and Yalta, would not fracture now. "You have no leverage," Smith told him bluntly. "Sign or the fighting continues." Desperation mounted. Friedberg radioed Donitz for reinforcements, and soon Colonel General Alfred Jodl arrived, the steely chief of the Wehrmacht's operations staff. Jodl was the architect behind many of Hitler's early triumphs: the Blitzkrieg through Poland in 1939, the swift fall of France in 1940, and the massive Operation Barbarossa against the Soviets in 1941. Tall, monocled, with an air of Prussian arrogance, he strode into the building as if victory were still within grasp. Observers noted his face bore the marks of immense strain, perhaps from a skin condition exacerbated by the war's toll. He met with Smith and British General Kenneth Strong, lecturing them on honor and the perils of Soviet expansion. "We can surrender in the West," Jodl proposed, "but grant us 48 hours to reposition in the East." It sounded logistical, a mere pause to relay orders amid chaotic communications. But the Allies saw through it. Those hours could shift entire divisions, undermining the Soviet front and risking a betrayal of their eastern ally. Smith consulted Eisenhower, who was pacing in his office, chain-smoking Camels and nursing cold coffee. Ike's response was unequivocal: no concessions. He had pledged to President Truman and Premier Stalin that surrender would be total and simultaneous. Any delay could spark suspicions, fracture the alliance, and even lay seeds for future conflict. Drawing on his Midwestern resolve, honed from a humble Kansas upbringing to commanding the largest invasion force in history, Eisenhower issued a chilling ultimatum through Smith: sign now or the Western Front seals shut. No more prisoners taken, no refugees allowed through. German forces would be trapped, facing the full weight of the Red Army alone. It was a masterstroke of pressure, leveraging the Germans' own fears against them without a single shot fired in that room. Jodl's facade cracked. The icy composure melted as he realized the bluff had failed. He requested time to contact Donitz, and as the clock ticked past midnight into May 7th, tension thickened. Adding to the drama was Major General Ivan Sesloparov, the Soviet liaison. He paced nervously, chain-smoking pungent Russian cigarettes, awaiting Moscow's approval. The lines were slow, Stalin's response delayed, perhaps intentionally. Sesloparov knew the stakes: sign without orders and face severe consequences, refuse and risk being blamed for a Western-only surrender. In the end, he gambled, adding a clause allowing for a potential follow-up ceremony to cover his position. At 2:41 a.m., under glaring floodlights in a map-strewn conference room, Jodl signed. No fanfare, just the scratch of pens on paper, Eisenhower's own gold Parker 51 among them. The document bound Germany to immediate, unconditional surrender everywhere. Jodl rose, his voice steady but strained. With this signature, the German people and armed forces are delivered into the victor's hands. I hope they will be treated with generosity. Smith's reply was curt: acknowledged, nothing more. The war in Europe had ended, not with triumph's roar but with quiet finality in a schoolroom. Yet Eisenhower remained apart. Escorted to his office, Jodl faced the Supreme Commander standing resolute. No handshake, no salute. Ike's questions were direct. Do you understand the terms? Full compliance? Personal responsibility for any breaches? Jodl affirmed, then was dismissed like an errant subordinate. Only then did Eisenhower allow a brief smile, toasting with flat champagne in tin cups. His cable to Washington was understated. The mission of this Allied force was fulfilled at 0241 local time, May 7, 1945. But the story didn't end there. Press embargoes, a rogue broadcast, and Stalin's demand for a Berlin redo turned victory into a diplomatic scramble. More on that in the next part, including the hidden roles of unsung figures who shaped this pivotal night. The drama in that smoke-filled schoolhouse in Reims didn't fade with the scratch of Jodl's pen at 2:41 a.m. on May 7, 1945. If anything, it intensified. The surrender document, unconditional, covering every front, every soldier, every ship and plane, was signed in 4 copies, one for each major Allied power. General Walter Bedell Smith, representing Eisenhower, accepted it with the same grim efficiency he'd shown throughout the negotiations. Major General Ivan Sesloparov, the Soviet representative, added his signature despite the radio silence from Moscow, slipping in that cautious clause about a possible later ceremony to shield himself from Stalin's wrath. French General François Sévez witnessed it all. No champagne flowed freely yet. The room stayed heavy with exhaustion and the weight of what had just ended. But the Germans' final plea for generosity toward their people lingered unanswered. Jodl's words hung in the air like the last echo of a regime that had promised a 1,000-year Reich and delivered ruin instead. Smith acknowledged the statement coldly: no promises, no warmth. The Germans were escorted out, past silent MPs who offered no salutes. Then came the moment that history books often gloss over. Eisenhower finally stepped into the room. He stood tall, unsmiling, behind his desk. Jodl clicked his heels in a stiff Prussian bow. Eisenhower returned no gesture of respect. His voice cut through the silence like a blade. Do you understand the terms? That this is unconditional surrender of all forces, everywhere, immediately? That your officers will be held personally responsible for any violations? Jodl affirmed quietly. Eisenhower held his gaze a beat longer, a look of absolute moral judgment, then dismissed him with 2 words: that is all. The Germans filed out, leaving behind the empty chair that symbolized everything Eisenhower refused to grant: dignity to those he saw as criminals, not honorable foes. As the door closed, the tension shattered. Eisenhower's shoulders relaxed for the first time in what felt like years. He rubbed his eyes, accepted a tin cup of flat champagne from a staffer, and raised it in a quiet toast. His official message to Washington was classic Ike, understated, devoid of drama. The mission of this Allied force was fulfilled at 0241 local time, May 7, 1945. No flowery declarations about crushing tyranny or dawn breaking over a free Europe. Just the facts. It was done. The man who had coordinated the largest military operation in history, who had stared down the D-Day weather and the Ardennes counteroffensive, simply wanted to sleep. But victory refused to stay quiet. 17 top correspondents, representing the Associated Press, CBS, Reuters and more, had been locked in the room during the signing, sworn to secrecy until coordinated Allied announcements. Brigadier General Frank Allen, SHAEF's public relations chief, herded them into a guarded room at the nearby Hotel Scribe in Paris. "Hold the story," he ordered. The reason? Stalin. The Soviet leader was furious about the Reims ceremony. He viewed it as a Western slight, diminishing the Red Army's monumental sacrifices and the brutal fight that had cost the Soviets millions. Stalin demanded the real surrender happen in Berlin on Soviet soil, with Soviet leadership presiding, to cement their role as the decisive force in defeating Nazism. The reporters fumed. They'd witnessed the biggest story of the century and now they were muzzled. Then came the breaking point. In Flensburg, where Donit's makeshift government still operated, German Foreign Minister Count Lutz Schwerin von Krosigk broadcast the news over radio. Germany had surrendered. The announcement hit the airwaves without any Allied embargo. Edward Kennedy, the Associated Press bureau chief in Paris, caught the broadcast. He weighed his options, the military's gag order versus the truth already public. He chose truth. Using a clandestine military line to London, he filed, "Flash, Germany has surrendered." The story exploded across America. Ticker tape reigned in New York streets. Crowds surged into Times Square. Spontaneous celebrations erupted from coast to coast. Back in Paris, the military erupted in anger. They suspended the Associated Press bureau, revoked Kennedy's credentials. Fellow journalists, bound by the rules, felt betrayed. Kennedy was fired by the AP. His career suffered lasting damage. It would take 67 years, until 2012, for the Associated Press to formally apologize, admitting he had acted correctly in breaking the embargo to report accurate news already public elsewhere. Meanwhile, Stalin got his way. On May 8, the exhausted Allies flew a new German delegation, led by Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, Donit's representative, to Berlin's Karlshorst suburb. In a former German army engineering school, under Marshal Georgy Zhukov's stern oversight, another surrender ceremony unfolded. This time there was pomp, vodka, caviar, a banquet stretching into dawn. Zhukov presided like a conqueror. Eisenhower, true to form, sent his deputy, Air Chief Marshal Arthur Tedder, refusing to attend what he saw as redundant theater. He'd accepted the surrender once, he didn't need the encore. The Berlin signing officially set the ceasefire at 11:01 p.m. Central European Time on May 8, V-Day in the West, May 9 in the Soviet calendar. Fighting in some pockets continued briefly, but the guns fell silent across Europe. Yet the Reims moment remained the true pivot, the place where Eisenhower's refusal to compromise preserved the Grand Alliance to the end, prevented a separate Western peace that could have fractured post-war Europe, and denied the Nazis any illusion of negotiated honor. In the end, the little red schoolhouse held the real power. Eisenhower's empty chair spoke volumes. No handshake, no chivalry for those responsible for atrocities that still haunted the liberators. By treating the German high command as defeated criminals rather than equals, he stripped away the last veneer of legitimacy from the regime. The silence of that refusal echoed louder than any victory speech. It declared that this war wasn't just about borders or power, it was about humanity's soul. And in that modest room, far from palaces or battlefields, the line was drawn that would define victory not as conquest but as justice. The war ended quietly there, but its shadows stretched forward. In the next part, we'll explore the immediate aftermath, the liberation of remaining camps, the rush to secure Nazi secrets, the dawning Cold War tensions already visible in Berlin, and how ordinary soldiers and civilians grappled with a world suddenly without the war that had defined their lives for years. The war in Europe ended in that modest Reims schoolhouse, but the real story of May 1945 was only beginning. Victory did not arrive as a clean break. It rolled out in waves of shock, relief, horror, and fragile hope. In the days and weeks that followed the signatures, the world confronted the full scale of what had been defeated, and what still needed rebuilding. First came the camps. As Allied troops pushed deeper into Germany in late April and early May, they stumbled upon places the Nazis had tried to hide. Ohrdruf, Buchenwald, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen. The names still carry a weight that no photograph can fully capture. American soldiers who entered these sites were hardened combat veterans, men who had seen death on beaches and in hedgerows. Yet nothing prepared them for the skeletal survivors, the mounds of unburied bodies, the stench that clung to uniforms for days. Eisenhower himself visited Ohrdruf on April 12. He walked through the wire, saw the crematoria, the mass graves. He turned to his companions and said quietly, "Get every newspaper man and every congressman you can find here. Let them see this." He understood that words alone would never suffice. People needed to witness the evidence of industrialized murder. Within hours, reporters and lawmakers arrived. Their dispatches carried the first unfiltered truth to the outside world. The scale: 6 million Jews murdered, millions more Roma, disabled people, political prisoners, Soviet POWs, began to sink in. The Nuremberg trials would later codify these crimes as genocide, but in those spring days of 1945, the horror was still raw, still unbelievable to many. Meanwhile, ordinary Germans faced their own reckoning. In cities reduced to rubble, Berlin a moonscape of shattered stone, Hamburg gutted by firestorms, Dresden still smoldering, millions emerged from cellars and bunkers into silence. No more air raid sirens, no more propaganda broadcasts. The swastika flags were torn down, sometimes burned in the streets. Children who had grown up saluting portraits of the Führer now stared at empty flagpoles. Women searched for husbands and sons among the returning columns of ragged Wehrmacht prisoners. Food was scarce. The black market became the only economy. Yet amid the hunger and despair, small acts of humanity flickered. American GIs shared K-rations with German children. British troops organized soup kitchens. The occupation authorities moved quickly to distribute relief supplies, knowing that starvation could breed chaos or resentment that might poison the peace. In the east, the contrast was stark. Soviet troops entered Berlin on May 2 after a battle that cost hundreds of thousands of lives. They raised the red flag over the Reichstag in one of the most iconic images of the war. But the Red Army's advance carried vengeance. Reports of mass reprisals against civilians spread quickly. Donetsk's government in Flensburg had surrendered partly out of terror at what awaited German soldiers and families in Soviet hands. Millions of refugees, ethnic Germans fleeing the eastern territories, poured westward in what became one of the largest population movements in history. The Potsdam Conference later formalized the expulsion of Germans from Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary, displacing up to 14 million people. The roads were clogged with carts, the old and the young walking beside them, carrying whatever they could salvage. Many never reached safety. Back in the West, the mood among the Allied troops shifted from euphoria to exhaustion. Men who had fought from Sicily to the Elbe now stood guard over defeated enemies. Some units threw impromptu parties, jeeps blaring music, looted wine shared around campfires. Others simply sat in stunned quiet. A GI in Patton's Third Army wrote home, "It's over, but it doesn't feel over. We keep waiting for the next shell." The sudden absence of danger left a void. Many soldiers struggled to imagine life without the rhythm of advance, combat, and survival. Politically, the cracks appeared almost immediately. At Yalta in February, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin had sketched a post-war Europe. Free elections, demilitarization of Germany, zones of occupation. By May, those agreements already felt fragile. Stalin's insistence on the Berlin ceremony was not mere ego. It signaled Moscow's determination to dominate Eastern Europe. Soviet forces halted short of Denmark and refused to withdraw from parts of Austria and Czechoslovakia they had occupied. In Poland, the Communist Provisional Government sidelined the London exiles. Churchill, watching from London, warned of an Iron Curtain descending across the continent, a phrase he would make famous the following year. Eisenhower, ever the coalition builder, tried to keep relations smooth, but even he sensed the alliance fracturing. The Cold War did not begin in 1947 with the Truman Doctrine. Its seeds were planted in the spring of 1945, in the different ways each victor interpreted unconditional surrender. For the German people, the immediate future was occupation and denazification. Questionnaires, tribunals, mandatory viewings of atrocity films. Former party members lost jobs. SS men faced arrest. Yet the process was uneven, pragmatism often trumped justice. Scientists, engineers, and intelligence officers with valuable knowledge were quietly recruited by both East and West. Operation Paperclip brought Wernher von Braun and his rocket team to America. Similar programs operated in the Soviet zone. The men who built the V-2s on slave labor would help launch the space age. By summer, the world tried to return to normal. Soldiers boarded ships home. Families scanned casualty lists, praying for miracles. In the United States, VE Day celebrations had been subdued. President Truman asked for restraint while fighting continued in the Pacific. But when Japan surrendered in August, the true global exhale came. The deadliest conflict in human history was finally over. Looking back at that night in Reims, the little red schoolhouse stands as more than a footnote. It was where moral clarity prevailed over military tradition. Eisenhower's refusal to shake hands, his empty chair, his cold finality toward Jodl and Friedberg, these were not acts of pettiness. They were deliberate signals. This regime had crossed lines that no uniform or rank could excuse. By denying the Nazis the ritual dignity of a warrior's farewell, Eisenhower helped ensure that the myth of the clean Wehrmacht never took firm root in the West. The surrender was not a gentleman's agreement between equals. It was judgment delivered. And so the war ended not with parades or grand oratory, but with a signature in a vocational classroom, a flat toast in tin cups, and the quiet resolve of a man who understood that true victory is measured not in territory gained, but in the principles preserved. 75 years later, that principle still echoes. Some lines must never be crossed, and when they are, the world must remember, and never negotiate with monsters as if they were merely opponents. The mission was fulfilled. And the world, scarred but breathing, began again.